Caracas woke up in silence. Not just any silence, but the kind that arises when something big has just happened. Streets are open, but less crowded. Businesses are open, but with their doors partially closed, people observing more than talking. Within hours, Nicolas Maduro's name was making international headlines, while within the country, the feeling was quite different: uncertainty. But what really happens in a capital city when the center of power disappears abruptly? What changes in the streets, in the institutions, and most importantly, in the lives of those who remain there? This documentary is not about speeches, it's not about isolated official versions, and it's not about making definitive predictions. It's about what comes after. What happens in the hours and days following a high-impact political event? When communications are brief, information is fragmented, and daily life must continue even without clear answers. Here, the focus is on Caracas, in the functioning of the city, in the behavior of institutions, based on the reaction of the population. Throughout this documentary, we will analyze how did the Venezuelan capital react in the first few hours? What happens to the functioning of the state in situations like this? How the world observes and responds, and what scenarios begin to unfold from this point on. Everything is based on available information, historical analysis, and patterns already observed in other similar episodes throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Because when power is suspended, the impact is never just political. He is human, he is urban, he is immediate. If this type of content is important to you, please consider supporting this work. Liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment helps keep this type of analysis alive and accessible. Your participation ensures that complex stories can be told calmly, with context, and responsibly. Now, let's go back to the streets of Caracas, and to understand how the city reacted in the first hours after this event. In the first hours after a major political event, a capital city does not immediately collapse. What happens first is something harder to measure, but easy to feel. A silent change in collective behavior. There are no constant sirens, nor continuous announcements. First and foremost, there is a change in pace. In Caracas, this change begins very early. The streets are awake as on any other day, but something about the flow of people catches the eye. Traffic exists, but it is less intense. Public transportation continues to operate, but the carriages carry fewer voices. People are present, but more attentive to their surroundings than to their own routines. In situations like this, the average citizen doesn't react with immediate panic. He observes, he listens, he tries to understand what has not yet been clearly explained. Small businesses raise their metal doors, some belatedly. Bakeries are open, markets are open, and pharmacies are serving customers. The city remains alive, but in a state of invisible containment, as if awaiting confirmation that has not yet arrived. It's the kind of waiting that doesn't paralyze you, but slows you down. On the sidewalks, conversations are shorter. Questions arise in a low voice. No one has complete answers, only fragments of information obtained from official broadcasts, shared messages, and images that circulate rapidly on cell phones. In times like these, information doesn't spread in a straight line. It fragments, repeats itself, and becomes distorted. The presence of the state in these early hours is not manifested by grand announcements, but by visual signals. Vehicles parked at strategic points, agents positioned at key intersections, reinforced checkpoints, more vigilant than active. It is not necessarily a matter of direct intervention, but of symbolic presence. This presence has a clear function: to convey the idea of continuity. To show that, despite the initial shock, there is still command, there is still observation, there is still structure. In capital cities that have experienced similar episodes throughout recent history, whether in Latin America, Eastern Europe, or the Middle East, this pattern tends to repeat itself. First, the observation, then the reorganization. People quickly notice when something has changed, even without fully understanding the extent of the change. Collective behavior adjusts almost instinctively. Simple decisions are now being evaluated more carefully. Go now or wait, leave early or stay home, spend or save. In many neighborhoods, the activity is concentrated in the early hours of the day. People take care of the essentials and return earlier, not by direct order, but by perception. When uncertainty prevails, routine becomes shorter. In these contexts, silence does not mean an absence of activity. It means caution. Caracas continues to function, but in a different way. More restrained, more attentive, more calculated. What we see in the first few hours is not disorder, but suspension. A collective pause, while everyone awaits clearer signs of what comes next. more detailed pronouncements, institutional confirmations, indications of continuity or breakage. And it is precisely in this interval, between what happened and what will still be explained, that the city reveals its true state. Not in speeches, but in actions. Not in headlines, but in the rhythm of the streets. Because for those who live there, the big question isn't geopolitics. It's not strategic. It's practical. Will the city continue to function the same way tomorrow? Will transportation operate normally? Will basic services remain accessible? Is routine still possible? Until those answers arrive, Caracas continues to live, not collapsing, not in complete normality, but on active standby. A city that keeps moving even without knowing exactly where it's going. When a major political event occurs at the highest levels of power, the most immediate question is not who takes over, but whether the state continues to function. Because governments can change, leaders can disappear from the scene, but state structures, when they are solid, tend to operate even under extreme pressure. In the first hours after a shock of this magnitude, what is observed is not an automatic change of command, but a period of controlled administrative suspension. It is a moment when decisions cease to be made on a political level and begin to be executed on a technical level. Ministries continue to operate. Essential services remain active. Public employees show up for work, not because everything is normal, but because the basic functioning of the state depends precisely on this silent continuity. In Caracas, as in other capitals that have faced similar disruptions, the machinery of the state does not come to an abrupt halt. She slows down, and in this process, each level of management begins to act with more caution. Orders are being re-evaluated. Authorizations take longer. Decisions that previously depended on political approval are now held up in intermediate layers of the bureaucracy, not out of resistance, but out of prudence. In this context, the security forces assume a central role, not as agents of confrontation, but as elements of stabilization. Their role, in the early hours, is not to act aggressively, but to ensure predictability. Posts remain active. Patrols follow regular routes. Existing protocols are maintained. The goal is simple: to prevent a temporary lack of clarity at the top from translating into disorder at the bottom. The chain of command, in these situations, does not break down immediately. She contracts. It will operate with less public exposure and more internal communication. In state systems that have already faced prolonged pressure, this behavior is not improvised. It is part of contingency plans designed specifically for scenarios of political instability. These plans do not define new directions. They simply ensure that minimum functionality is preserved while the larger scenario reorganizes itself. At this stage, the state enters risk management mode. The focus is no longer on expansion, announcements, or renovations. It becomes maintenance. Maintain energy, maintain transportation, maintain supply, maintain basic security. At the same time, there is a deliberate reduction in public communication. Statements are short. Statements avoid details. In these cases, institutional silence is not a sign of inaction, but a strategy. Every word is now being calculated, because in moments like these, misinterpreted statements can generate chain reactions that are difficult to contain. Inside the administrative buildings, the atmosphere is one of active waiting. Meetings are held behind closed doors. Information circulates in a restricted manner. Reports are constantly updated. The state does not collapse immediately because its survival depends precisely on this ability to function without temporary political prominence. The major weakness lies not in the administrative machinery itself, but in the duration of this suspension. The longer the situation remains undefined, the greater the internal strain. Employees begin to question management. Protocols are beginning to be reinterpreted, and the uncertainty, which is initially contained, begins to infiltrate day-to-day decisions. It is at this point that continuity ceases to be automatic and begins to depend on clearer definitions of command, legitimacy, and direction. But in the early stages, what we see is a state that does not disappear. It shuts down, it is protected, and wait. Because beyond the political disputes, there is a silent truth. A country cannot come to a complete standstill, not even for a single day. And while the immediate future remains uncertain, the state continues to operate. Not with complete confidence, not with absolute normality, but with the only thing possible at that moment: institutional caution. When a political event of great impact occurs in a strategically relevant country, the reaction is not limited to its borders. It spreads rapidly to diplomatic centers, security offices, and monitoring rooms around the world. In the following hours, Caracas ceases to be merely a capital under internal observation and begins to occupy a central place in international attention, not through fiery speeches or immediate announcements, but through a careful analysis of what that event represents in the regional balance. In situations like this, the international community reacts in layers. First, observe, then evaluate, and only then does it begin to position itself more clearly. Initial statements are usually short, calculated, and full of diplomatic terms. Words like monitoring, concern, and close follow-up come up frequently. They do not indicate passivity, but caution. Every government, every international organization, and every regional bloc needs to respond not only to what happened, but to what might happen from that point on. And this evaluation is not done in public. Behind the scenes, embassies exchange information. Diplomatic channels are activated. Reports are updated hourly. The initial focus is not on taking sides, but on understanding the stability of the situation. Venezuela has occupied a sensitive position on the geopolitical chessboard for decades. Not only because of its strategic location, but also because of its resources, its recent history, and its regional and international connections. Any abrupt change in its political leadership reverberates beyond its borders. Neighboring countries are watching with heightened attention, not only because of the economic or migratory impact, but also because of the risk of prolonged instability. Past experiences show that internal crises rarely remain isolated. Multilateral organizations enter a state of technical alert, not to intervene immediately, but to map out possible scenarios. Contingency plans are being reviewed. Diplomatic protocols are being re-evaluated. At the same time, major powers are analyzing the situation from a broader perspective. It's not just about what happens in Caracas, but about how it can alter trade routes, energy flows, and strategic alignments. In such cases, the international reaction does not manifest itself in a single decisive gesture. It is built through accumulation, through subtle signs, through movements that individually seem small, but together indicate a change in posture. Sanctions are not announced immediately. Political endorsements are not declared hastily. Silence, once again, serves as a tool. Because in unstable scenarios, a hasty statement can close doors that still need to remain open. Diplomacy, at times like these, is less about public positioning and more about preserving channels of communication. Meanwhile, external pressure begins to build up indirectly, through markets that react, through investors pulling back, through business partners who adopt a wait-and-see approach. Political instability doesn't need official announcements to produce real effects. It infiltrates the global systems almost automatically. For the local population, these external reactions are still abstract in the first few hours. But from a strategic standpoint, they are beginning to shape the room for maneuver available to the country. Each day without a clear plan increases external influence. Each week without a resolution increases the weight of international pressure. And every decision made from this global perspective carries consequences that extend beyond the domestic sphere. It is at this point that the crisis ceases to be merely internal and transforms into an episode of global interest. Not by choice of the country, but due to the interdependence of the modern world. International reaction alone does not determine the future, but it defines the possible paths. And while Caracas remains in a state of active waiting, the world observes, calculates, and prepares. Because in a connected global system, no capital city goes into lockdown without others reacting. When high-impact political events strike at the center of power, their most profound effects rarely appear in the initial official statements. They manifest themselves gradually, silently, and in a profoundly human way, reflecting in the daily lives of those who do not participate in the decisions, but live with their consequences every day. In the hours and days that follow, the population enters a state that is neither exactly one of panic nor of normality. It is a state of constant vigilance, in which every simple decision is considered more carefully than usual. People are still waking up early. They continue trying to maintain routines, but they do this while paying close attention to the signs around them. The tone of the conversations changes. The volume decreases. The exchange of information becomes cautious. In markets and fairs, consumer behavior changes almost imperceptibly. Purchases are no longer impulsive. Products considered essential will be prioritized, not in direct order, but through collective memory. Populations that have already experienced periods of instability quickly learn to recognize patterns. In these contexts, fear does not manifest itself as overt hysteria. It emerges as an anticipation. It's like trying to prepare for something that hasn't happened yet, but seems possible. Families talk to each other more. They are planning alternative routes. They coordinate their schedules. Physical presence becomes valued. Going home early becomes a recurring choice. For many, the greatest source of anxiety is not the immediate lack of resources, but the absence of clear information. The information vacuum creates space for rumors, interpretations, and conflicting versions. And when that happens, trust shifts to smaller circles: family, neighbors, acquaintances. The city, as a social organism, enters a mode of self-protection. There is no open chaos, but there is retreat. Events are being postponed. Travel distances are reduced. Social life shrinks. Among workers, the focus is on continuity. Will the job be maintained? Will public transportation be running tomorrow? Will the payment be affected? Practical questions replace abstract debates. Prolonged uncertainty takes its toll in different ways. It doesn't cause immediate explosions, but rather accumulated emotional exhaustion. With each passing day lacking clear answers, the effort to maintain normalcy demands more energy. Children notice the change even without understanding the context. Quieter environments. Adults need to be more attentive. Stricter routines. Instability communicates itself without words. For the elderly, the impact is usually even more significant. Sudden changes trigger memories of past crises. The comparison with other difficult periods comes spontaneously. The past serves as a reference point for interpreting the present. What we generally see is not immediate social disruption, but adaptation. A silent adaptation made up of small daily adjustments that, added together, profoundly alter the way of life. The population does not come to a standstill. She's reorganizing herself. And this reorganization happens before any official announcement, before any institutional definition. Because for those who live the daily grind, waiting is not a passive option, it's a strategy. While analysts discuss scenarios and governments calculate moves, millions of people continue to deal with instability in a practical, concrete, and continuous way, trying to preserve what's essential, trying to maintain the dignity of routine. The human impact of events like this is not measured in speeches, but in actions, in the silence of the streets at dusk, in a hurry to get back home. Be cautious in every simple decision, and it is precisely at this level, far from the spotlight and international negotiations, that the crisis becomes most real. Because when power is suspended, it's not the institutions that feel it first, it's the people. When a country enters a period of prolonged political standstill, the immediate future is rarely defined by a single decisive event. It is built through successive layers of decisions, many of them made away from the spotlight, in technical, military, and diplomatic spaces where time runs differently. The first possibility that arises in scenarios like this is controlled continuity. In this model, institutions continue to operate based on existing structures, while internal adjustments are made gradually. There is no explicit rupture, but there is also no full return to the previous normality. The country is now living in an intermediate state, functional but tense. This type of continuity depends on three main factors: preserving the chain of command, the administrative capacity of the state, and the acceptance, albeit silent, of the population. When these elements persist, the instability tends to continue without exploding. The system is not progressing, but it is not collapsing either. It rests on the fragile balance between waiting and adapting. A second possible scenario is that of a gradual transition. In this case, the suspension period begins to be filled with clearer institutional movements. New leaders are emerging. Temporary arrangements are taking shape. The official discourse begins to be organized around terms such as normalization, reorganization, and reconstruction. Transitions of this type are rarely quick. They require internal negotiation, external recognition, and above all, time. Each step needs to be calibrated to avoid chain reactions that could compromise the minimum stability achieved. This scenario tends to generate more visible expectations among the population. Uncertainty doesn't disappear, but it begins to be accompanied by concrete signs of change. And these signs, even small ones, have a direct impact on collective behavior. There is also a third, more delicate path: the indefinite prolongation of uncertainty. In this scenario, no clear definition is established. The institutions continue to function, but under increasing strain. External pressure intensifies, and the population begins to live in a permanent state of waiting. In the long term, this model is the most difficult to sustain, not due to a lack of immediate structure, but because of the progressive exhaustion it causes. Prolonged uncertainty erodes trust, weakens predictability, and makes every decision more burdensome. From a strategic point of view, the longer a country remains without a clear definition, the smaller its margin of autonomy becomes. Dependence on external factors increases. Decisions begin to be influenced by pressures that do not originate internally. None of these scenarios can be considered in isolation. In practice, the future is usually a combination of these. Moments of continuity followed by attempts at transition, progress interrupted by new periods of suspension. What defines the course is not just the initial event, but the ability to respond over time, the ability to adapt structures without completely breaking them down, to communicate without causing panic, to maintain functionality without ignoring the need for change. For the population, these scenarios translate into something simple yet profound: the possibility of planning for tomorrow. When this possibility exists, even in a limited way, society finds ways to move forward. When she disappears, the impact accumulates. The immediate future of Venezuela, like that of any country in a similar situation, will not be decided by a single announcement or symbolic gesture. It will be shaped by discrete decisions made day after day as the country tries to balance stability, pressure, and expectation. And until that balance is defined, the country remains at a critical point in history, not standing still, not resolved, but moving slowly, under constant observation. Moments like this are rarely heralded as historic while they are happening. They don't arrive with set dates nor with complete explanations. On the contrary, they emerge shrouded in silence, fragmented information, and a collective feeling that something has changed, even when it's not yet clear exactly what. Caracas, at this point in history, is experiencing more than just a political episode. He's experiencing a break. A space between what was known and what has not yet been fully revealed. And it is during this interval that the most profound transformations usually occur. Over the past few decades, history has shown time and again that major changes don't happen immediately. They are built gradually through technical decisions, institutional adjustments, and everyday behaviors that adapt to the new reality, even before fully understanding it. What we are seeing now is a country that hasn't stopped, but also hasn't moved forward. A state that continues to operate, but cautiously. A population that continues to live, but under constant observation. And an international community that is following every move, aware that the outcome is still uncertain. This type of historical suspension is not uncommon. It has already occurred in different parts of the world, under varied contexts, with equally distinct outcomes. Sometimes it led to processes of reorganization and transition. In other cases, it prolonged periods of instability. And in certain cases, it paved the way for profound changes that would only be fully understood years later. What defines these paths is not just the initial event, but how it is managed over time. The ability to maintain functionality without ignoring the need for resetting, to preserve order without stifling adaptation, communicating without fueling fear. To an outsider, these days may seem static, but internally they are characterized by constant movement, a silent movement, made up of administrative decisions, discrete negotiations, and gradual adjustments that rarely make headlines. For those living within the country, the impact is more direct. It manifests itself in daily life, in the way of planning the next day, paying close attention to environmental cues, in a continuous attempt to maintain personal stability amidst collective uncertainty. History is not written solely through grand speeches or public acts. It takes shape through the accumulation of small choices, made at times when the future is still unclear. And that is exactly what is shaping up now. What is happening in Caracas right now is not the end of the world. It's a pause full of meaning, a moment when time seems to slow down, allowing structures to be tested, limits to be revealed, and directions to begin to take shape. The outcome is still undecided, and maybe it won't be for a while. But it is precisely this uncertainty that makes the current period so relevant from a historical point of view. Because when power is suspended, what's at stake is not just who governs, but how an entire society reacts to the absence of immediate answers. How institutions sustain themselves, how people adapt, and how the future begins to take shape, even before it is announced. History, at this moment, is not moving in a straight line. She moves slowly, closely watched, while each decision made today shapes the path of tomorrow. And that's why understanding what's happening now matters. Not just to understand the present, but to recognize in the future the exact moment when everything began to change. If you value analysis and narrated documentaries, please consider supporting this content. By liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment, you help support this type of content. Here, complex stories are not treated as quick headlines but as chapters in a larger process, and your participation is part of that.